back to the Daily Grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back pickle biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
And we're back with Stipe Miocic versus anybody. Now, I know we usually would call this Stipe Miocic versus the world, but I just think versus anybody has a better ring to it, and actually it sounds more like what we're doing anyway. So for anybody that might be new to these versus anybody, in this case Stipe Miocic versus anybody, what I do is I go through the history of a specific fighter, and then I also go through how I feel like they would perform versus the top 15 athletes of their respective divisions. So for this case, Stipe Miocic is going to be the heavyweight division. A lot of you watching this video knows that Stipe Miocic is the current UFC heavyweight champion, so it's not going to be too surprising how I feel he's going to do versus a lot of the guys in the top 15. But I still wanted to do this video because, for one, Stipe Miocic is arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, and he's got a very impressive resume on top of that. So that's what we're going to get into first, so walk with me as we get into Stipe Miocic versus anybody. This is Stipe Miocic's full UFC fight history as a professional. If you go to Sherdog.com, you can get his entire fight history as you can with any fighter. But since Stipe Miocic already has 20 professional fights, I just got the ones that would fit on screen, and we'll just use his UFC fights. So he started off in the UFC on a 3-fight winning streak, and then he took his first loss, Stipe Miocic, as a professional, not even just in the UFC. You see Stipe Miocic is 18-2. Both of those losses came in the UFC. So he took his first loss 4 fights into the UFC to Stefan the Skyscraper Struve, who is going to be fighting Andrei Arlovsky at the UFC 22 co-main event. So if he can get a big win there, Stefan Struve, Stipe Miocic might be able to get this rematch back. That is one of the only losses on his resume, and it is the only one that he didn't get back. As you see, he went on another 3-fight winning streak after losing to Stefan Struve, and it was actually notable heavyweights: Roy Nelson, Gabriel Gonzaga, and Fabio Maldonado. Stipe Miocic beat on his 3-fight winning streak. Then he took a loss to former UFC heavyweight champion Junior Dos Santos. Now that fight, some people had Stipe Miocic winning. It was a decision, and as I said, Stipe Miocic did go on to avenge that loss. So with that being said, Stipe Miocic is now currently on a 6-fight winning streak, most recently defending his heavyweight title versus Francis Ngannou at UFC 220. In that fight, Stipe Miocic broke the UFC heavyweight title defense record. He's defended his belt now 3 times, which is very impressive considering it's the heavyweight division. That's why that broke the record. I mean, in the heavyweight division, these guys are, there's a 60-pound weight gap. So, I mean, Francis Ngannou had 40 pounds on Stipe Miocic. I know at weigh-ins it was only 20 pounds, but you have to consider Francis Ngannou probably rehydrated up past 265 pounds. That's a very realistic assessment. So, there was reports that Francis Ngannou came into the fight at 285 pounds, but he did weigh in 20 pounds over Stipe Miocic, and he still defended his title successfully. And in the heavyweight division, it only takes one shot, whether it's a guy with the most skills in the world or the least skills in the world. It only takes one shot to really end your streak. So that's why there's only been 3 successful heavyweight title defenses for the record. So Stipe Miocic broke that record, and he made his claim for definitely the greatest UFC heavyweight in UFC history, but also arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time. Now, of course, there's going to be the people that bring up Fedor, but in my head, as the sports evolve, any guy from 30 years ago, 20 years ago, is not going to be as good as today. 20 years from now, there's going to be a heavyweight that's better than Stipe Miocic as the sport evolves and fighters continue to grow into the sport of mixed martial arts. You know what I'm saying? Like the Aaron Picos of the world. There's going to be a heavyweight Aaron Pico that started training wrestling when he was 5 and boxing when he was... So, the sport evolves. So that's what I'm saying. That's why Stipe Miocic would get my vote for greatest heavyweight of all time. And with that being said, let's get into how I believe Stipe Miocic would do versus the top 15 fighters currently in the heavyweight division of the UFC. Now, W's. That's what I see from Stipe Miocic. Even in a rematch with Stefan Struve, who he has a loss to, I believe Stipe Miocic is way farther in his game. He lost to Stefan Struve just 4 fights into the UFC. Now he's almost 12 fights, probably more than 12 fights in the UFC, heavyweight champion, and I just think Francis Ngannou would be able to beat Stefan Struve if they ever were to rematch. Now, Francis Ngannou's the current #1 champion, Alistair Overeem, our #1 contender, Alistair Overeem, #2 contender, Fabricio Verdum, #3 contender. Stipe Miocic has already beat all 3 of those guys. Cain Velasquez is one person that people still want to see Stipe Miocic tested against. Cain Velasquez, former UFC heavyweight champion that's been battling injuries. They've been plaguing his career, so once he is healthy, which is looking like that date may come soon, people do want to see Stipe Miocic versus Cain Velasquez. But that's really the only heavyweight left people even consider that have a chance at beating Stipe Miocic. I mean, maybe Stefan Struve, there's going to be an argument there, but I would pick Stipe. And honestly, if Cain Velasquez and Stipe Miocic were to fight next, I would probably lean towards Stipe. I mean, Stipe Miocic was just an underdog coming into his 3rd title defense as a heavyweight, which is just pretty insane in my head, especially knowing how the fight played out. I mean, of course, coming into the fight, a lot of people believe the hype on Francis Ngannou, you know, and as far as the hype, he can still knock anybody out. That's what he was doing. If they fought again and Francis Ngannou just so happened to catch Stipe, it's very possible he could take him out, which is why even though Francis Ngannou got exposed according to a lot of people, he's still going to probably be a top 10 heavyweight for years to come, even if he, you know, because if he fights like a Derek Lewis, you know, who's probably even got better cardio than Francis Ngannou, some would argue. If he fights Mark Hunt, he's got a chance to clip these guys. Just because Stipe Miocic beat Francis Ngannou in a dominant fashion doesn't mean every single heavyweight's going to. And as we said earlier in the video, this is the heavyweight division, and you're always one shot away from going out. So with that being said, I don't see any I don't think there's a heavyweight in the world, in the Bellator roster, UFC roster, Risen roster. There's no heavyweight on the planet today that could beat Stipe Miocic. I think he is the baddest man on the planet, and that's not the case with all champions of their division. Usually, you look at a champion like maybe a Conor McGregor and you say, yeah, but I don't know if he can beat Khabib. There's not really somebody in the heavyweight division you look at and you would say is the favorite over Stipe Miocic. And I know that's crazy to say considering he was just the underdog versus Francis Ngannou of all people, but that I don't believe he would be the underdog coming into any more of these fights. The next realistic fights for Stipe Miocic are either Fabricio Verdum or Cain Velasquez. Now, Dana White has said that he doesn't want to give Stipe Miocic or Cain Velasquez an immediate title shot due to his health issues. You know, if you schedule a huge fight, Stipe Miocic versus Cain Velasquez, and Cain Velasquez isn't able to make the fight, you know, that would kind of suck. So it's probably going to be Fabricio Verdum, who, since losing his title to Stipe Miocic, has put together 2 very impressive wins, and he lost once, but it was via split decision to Alistair Overeem, and a lot of people had Fabricio winning that fight. He didn't get the finish, so Alistair's hand was raised, but I had Fabricio winning that fight. And so Fabricio's looked really impressive since losing his title, and I don't see any other people in the division that deserve a title shot more than Fabricio right now, aside from arguably Cain Velasquez. So with that being said, this is Stipe Miocic versus anybody. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. I'm out. I think I'm going to do Kamaru Usman next, so stay tuned for that, by the way.
Bye, Felicia.